The Gators Breakdown podcast is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters, and you can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Joining me in this episode as we finally take a look at the Gators' opponents for this coming season. And Mark Rogers from Mark Rogers TV channel on YouTube joins me. Mark, thanks for joining me here for the first time on Gators Breakdown. I've been on your show plenty of times. We kind of cut our teeth a little bit together on YouTube years ago, and just finally get you to talk some Gators and some Gators opponents here for Miami and FSU. And guys, listeners, if you want some of the best college football coverage out there, then you have to give Mark Rogers a follow on his YouTube channel. Go subscribe there, and you are set for some great analysis on the sport we love so much. But Mark, like I said, thanks again for coming on here.
Absolutely. Kind of different being on this side of it, but I'll wait for the questions to be coming my way instead of doing it the other way around.
Absolutely. So, like I said, this episode starts to look at the Gators' opponents for the season, and we're starting with Miami and Florida State. And Mark, I wanted to bring you on because you do a great job with these two teams, and what do you have in relation to these two teams going on Mark Rogers TV?
So every Wednesday night, we've got a lineup with 3 live streams. We've got a Florida State talk that we've added about 10 weeks ago. So Florida State live at 7 o'clock Eastern time, Miami at 8 o'clock Eastern time. That has been going on for several months. And then throw in Ohio State at 9 o'clock. What the heck? 9 o'clock Eastern time with some Buckeyes talk.
Absolutely. So when fans go and check out these live streams, what can they expect as far as guests and analysis that they'll get on Florida State and Miami?
Yeah, so we've got pretty much the same lineup every week in regards to the guests that I have on. So we want to maintain some consistency, but we move some people in and out. So you're going to see SB Nation bloggers. You're going to see writers for 247 Sports, Rivals, those type people that know what they're talking about in regards to those 3 programs come on and talk up those 3 programs.
All right. Before we dive into Miami and FSU, hey, kind of the bookend of Florida's schedule. Florida starts the season with Miami, ends the season with FSU. But before we get there, remember you can find Gators Breakdown on news4jax.com/Gators Breakdown. You'll find all the Gators Breakdown episodes there, as well as articles from the News for Jax sports team. Catch the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, YouTube as well. Using those services, please share, rate, and review the show, and follow us on social media as well. At Gators Breakdown on Twitter and Facebook as well. And don't forget, August 17th, kickoff party here in Jacksonville, Red Gill Bistro, August 17th, the week before Florida-Miami kickoff. If you can't find the RSVP on Twitter, reach out to me at gatorsbreakdown@gmail.com. Mark, so these preseason magazines that come out, they come out late May. But my favorite aspect of these college football preview magazines are getting the anonymous coaches' thoughts on the two teams. We'll do this for Miami and FSU. We'll start with Miami first. And here, so it says opposing coaches size up Miami. And quote right here, one of the most unique first years I think we've ever seen between Manny Diaz leaving the program for Temple and then coming back to replace Mark Richt. You've got consistency in the program on the defensive side of the ball and relationships on the defense. Then you add in the new transfer portal and they're going to look totally different at a lot of places in week 1. If it works, everyone will try to copy it. The guys we've seen coming in from the portal have made them more athletic, more competitive, and right away. The actual high school recruiting class wasn't good by their standards. Defensively, keeping all 3 linebackers make them good right away. Add that with the new guys at the defensive end and that one from Virginia Tech, Trevon Hill. Dan Enos is going to bring more of a pro-style look into Miami. I think you're looking at Tua Tagovailoa and Jalen Hurts, and what Alabama did, that's more of him adjusting to the superior talent to Alabama. We think you aren't going to see them go heavy on RPO. To be clear, you'll see it, or at least you should, because they have guys who can do it, but they will go more pro-base and build off of that. It's obviously Tate Martell's job to lose at quarterback. He's better than anyone they've had while Mark Richt was there. So a lot to digest there as far as what opposing coaches say, but let's go back to the beginning of it and kind of surprise move of Manny Diaz getting the Temple job and just a few days later getting named the Miami head coach when Mark Richt retires. Based on who you've talked to, Mark, and your thoughts as well from following college football for so long, what is Miami getting in Manny Diaz?
Well, Manny Diaz, they get a guy that has a large investment in the program already. The first year of a coach taking over a program, we tend to give them a little bit of leeway in terms of trying to build their culture. The terminology is different. The schemes might be different. Obviously, they typically bring in their own coaches on both sides of the football. So the players got to get used to the individual position coaches, different approaches, the whole deal might be slightly different. And we'll talk some Florida State where we got a lot of that. But with Miami, obviously, Manny Diaz, he was in charge of the dominant side of the football at Miami. So he's got the buy-in already from the players. They already like him. They know him. They know what he's all about. He's kind of this odd combination of Miami guy, Florida State guy, graduated from Florida State, but he's a Miami guy in that he's been in the program and obviously cut his teeth at other places like Texas, but his father was the mayor of Miami. And he seems to bring just, it's this recent trend, I think, of hiring excitable guys that can connect to the players. The Nick Sabans and Urban Meyers would roll out the resume or the track record. Miami's got a guy here that's going to excite and connect with younger players, and he's already been able to do that. He somewhat recovered. There was a mention there to the recruiting class. He somewhat recovered it, brought it back to respectability, was able to save much of it. The Mark Richt, I know we don't have time for it now, but I'm just fascinated as to what happened there because he just brought in an rated recruiting class, a top 10 team that went to an Orange Bowl. And then suddenly it seemed like he just gave up and maybe the family ties were too strong for him to do the right thing and basically save himself. But I think Manny Diaz is a good hire. He's kind of an unpredictable hire. But again, this is another trend that we see in college football. Ryan Day at Ohio State, Lincoln Riley at Oklahoma, where guys have no head coaching experience at this level. They're given the keys, and they seem to have done rather well. Dabo Swinney a decade ago, and some other ones across the country. Most of them have fared well. Others, like a Clay Helton, is a mixed bag.
Well, we know that the questions, there's not a lot of questions on defense, and we'll get to that. But offense is on the mind of everybody there. Hiring Dan Enos as the offensive coordinator. Some, he's thought of, he's well thought of in some places, and not so highly thought of in other places. And some maybe gets too much credit for what he did at Alabama last year, or maybe not enough credit for what he did at Alabama last year. So there's an enigma there in Enos, I think, as well. They mentioned maybe a change toward more of a pro style offense. That's what some of the coaches just said in that quote I read. But in college football, I don't think you can go total pro style there, and especially with what Miami has done the last couple of years. So in bringing Enos in, and then the questions they have at quarterback, there's probably at OC and at quarterback. Those are the two big issues that really kind of have to be figured out when Florida and Miami kick off in week 0.
Dave, I don't think there was a team in the country that had as much of a discrepancy between offensive production and defensive production.
And us Gator fans are used to that.
Well, yeah, you've been through it for a long time, not just 1 year,
right.
Year after year after year after year since Tebow left, pretty much. Man, yeah, it's just strange, and that can't be good for a locker room. Even though you preach it, we're a team, we're a brotherhood, we're united. It's got to wear on guys when they're busting their tail and giving up 16 points or whatever it was a game and losing ball games. But man, even when you dive into the advanced metrics beyond, it gets even worse for what the offense produced last year versus what we saw out of the defense. The advanced metrics speak better for the defense than the actual aggregate standard traditional statistical totals. But the interesting here, so if you're a Miami fan, I think you can gain some hope in a few areas. Number one, my goodness, Dave, wouldn't you love to take your team to the ACC Coastal? You take Florida to the ACC. That's an awful division. It's the worst division in college football. It is close, maybe with the Pac-12 South. The Big Ten West has gotten a lot better. It's just wide open. How does a team that's recruited? So the recruiting classes that will be on the field for Miami this year are as good as 8th in the country and as bad as 22nd and anywhere in between. So they've got recruiting classes in the teens, facing teams that have recruiting classes in the 40s and 50s. Pretty much across the board. Virginia Tech a little bit better. North Carolina, it would surprise people, a little bit better than the rest of them as well. So they have a huge talent advantage. For them not to be winning this division most years is ridiculous. And they've got one out of pretty much, if Virginia wins this year, they have exactly shared the division 7 times with the 7 teams in the division for the last 7 years. So if they can solve the quarterback position, because they have a great stable of running backs and wide receivers, the offensive line has been awful in recent years. But the play calling may have played into that. You talk to Miami fans, and they'll maybe oversell this, that the offensive line wasn't that bad, that the play calling was that predictable, that, of course, the defense had a head start on each play, and so that the offensive line didn't have a chance. But the ray of hope, or it's actually pretty legitimate and valid, is that you've got 3 quarterbacks who were 4 and 5 stars. So you're not riding your hopes on one of them. And so if they can make the right decision in fall camp, then the odds of all 3 of them failing is pretty much of a stretch. I got to think that one of them is going to come through. They all have tremendous talent. They're fairly similar quarterbacks, not completely. N'Kosi Perry's got a stronger arm. Tate Martell would be the least accurate, but the upside in the run game. So they have slightly different skill sets, but it's not like they have to overhaul the offense based on one choice of a quarterback in one direction or the other. So, man, when you got 3 guys that are pretty high ceiling guys, they're just inexperienced. Obviously, Perry's got about 6 starts under his belt last year and played a little bit. He actually had more pass attempts than Malik Rozier, the opening day starter last year, and pretty inaccurate, 50%. But they also were one of the top teams in the nation in dropped passes and 13 TDs and 6 picks. So he's got the experience. A lot of people are high on. It seems like Tate Martell is the bipolar one in terms of fan reaction. Some people love him. I think that's because of where he came from, both in college and in high school, and the 5-star. But he had a couple off days early in spring practice, and that kind of soured him for a number of people that got to see him throw, not on his best day, but I don't think he's that bad, but he's not a great thrower. Can't make quite the throws that the other 2 guys can. And Jaron Williams is the guy that everybody forgets about, but he certainly is a talented kid too.
Mark, before we move on to some other positions of offense, when camp started, Florida Miami start camp a week earlier before everybody else. Well, should it have come as a big surprise that it was Tate Martell taking the reps with the rest of the offense and Jaron Williams actually second? N'Kosi Perry was third. To me, that leads to believe, and of course, following Miami a little more closely this year because it is Florida's first opponent, that there might have maybe been some off-field issues that N'Kosi Perry wasn't necessarily taken care of in between spring during the summer months and starting fall camp.
Yeah, so that goes back to the Mark Richt season in 2018, where if you're just looking at straight football, you're thinking at some point in the season, Malik Rozier has tapped out. We know where he not tapped out in terms of effort, but tapped out in regards to ceiling. We know who this kid is. He's really not that good. Why is Perry not starting? The season's unraveled. They've lost games. They're not going to win the division. Why is he not playing? Well, then we find out certainly there were off-field issues, nothing extremely serious, but he got himself in the doghouse. And Mark Richt is pretty much on one end of the spectrum when it comes to discipline and wanting guys to do the right things. We could have a debate about whether, he took that to an extreme, but he certainly tied his wagon to Malik Rozier and went that direction. And Perry could have played a lot more football last year. Not that he played great, but that may tell us something. I think it also may tell us that it's a wide open deal, wide open competition. We're not giving anybody the nod. And since we know more about Perry, and he's got about 150 pass attempts roughly under heavy fire last year, we at least know what he can and can't do versus the other 2 are just who knows. So let's give them more reps.
I think they'll need help from a running back stable that loses Travis Homer. Mark, but I did find an interesting stat. 191 yards they averaged on the ground. And that was the most in a season at Miami since their 2001 national championship team with 204.6 yards. So Travis Homer, as I mentioned, gone and his 985 yards. You do have DJ Dallas, who brought about 100 carries and 600 yards with him. Is this group going to be led by DJ Dallas and then kind of filled in with Cameron Harris and Lorenzo Lingard?
See, that's the thing is that you can look at depth charts, but that's another debate as to who's the best running back, because DJ Dallas, he's ran very well in the opportunities that he's gotten. He's had a few streaks of fumble issues that have hurt him. The other two guys, when you talk Lingard, who's been banged up a little bit and his health is a little bit in question, but he should be okay. And then you talk about Cam Harris now, used to be Davis, now Harris. He was a top 10 running back. I know Lingard gets a little bit more play because depending on your service, he was either the number 1 or 2 running back the year he came out. But Harris was like number 8 in the country. So we both know that typically doesn't mean a whole lot, that they got 3 capable running backs. And I think that's a battle too in regards to determining how those carries are going to get distributed. But I would say, yeah, you're right. DJ Dallas is the guy in the clubhouse that most likely is going to get the starts right out of the gate unless he falters. But they're pretty, they don't have a real deep roster of running backs, but when you get 3 potentially really good ones, I think they're good at running back.
Receiver, I tell you what, it could have been so much worse if some things didn't happen and kind of fall their way. Jeff Thomas was going to Illinois. He was up in Illinois. Then all of a sudden, he's back at Miami. Once Manny Diaz gets in, looks like he may just not have wanted to play for Mark Richt. Then you get KJ Osborne, who was at Buffalo. It transfers in as one of the max, Buffalo is a max school. So he was one of the top targets, top wide receivers in that conference. Lawrence Kager goes to Georgia, but you did get Harley back as well. I know, and Jeremiah Payton, who's from here in Jacksonville, he's probably the young receiver they're looking at to take that next step down there in Coral Gables. This wide receiver core, as we kind of mentioned, and kind of some correlations to Florida, when maybe not have a quarterback, maybe not have an offensive line, but there's talent at wide receiver. That may be the case here for Miami too. If they can get some quarterback play, if they can get better protection from the offensive line, this receiver core is looked at as a bright spot.
Yeah, they've got really good guys. They've got depth. They pretty much have what you have. I don't know that they've got a true number 1. I think that guy was Amon Richards. Unfortunately, he only caught 1 pass, and he was done last year and has football-related injuries that ended his career, neck and spinal injuries. So he was the guy. He was the ACC Freshman of the Year. But Jeff Thomas would tend to be the guy, but he's more of a deep threat. I don't know that he's necessarily the guy that's going to catch 8 or 10 passes in any given week. He's more of a 5-catch guy. Let's take the top off the defense a couple times. Mismatch on the outside. KJ Osborne, as you mentioned, is the intriguing one, because anytime you bring in a guy who was very successful but at a slightly lower level, is he going to be able to step up and be a number 1? But he caught 53 passes and 8 TDs for Buffalo. But according to all scouting, and I didn't catch a whole lot of Buffalo last year, but I knew who he was and that he was a really good player, and we'll see if that translates to this level. But yeah, Mike Harley's a really good player as well. They lost Lawrence Cager, who went to Georgia. Miami fans aren't necessarily sorry about that. He dropped a lot of passes last year, but also contributed 30 or 35 catches, something in that range. But it's a deep group that had a lot of those, probably more so than just about any team in the country, at least in the Power 5, had a lot of those, balls get thrown in the dirt in front of them and, 4 yards behind them, and just horrible quarterback play and inaccurate passing to a large degree that we'll get to see maybe what they truly can do this year.
In the offensive line, before we move to the defensive side, 2 of the 7 players who were in the rotation for 2018 are back. You got junior Navon Donaldson, started 12 games last year. Between the right side of the line, there probably be a better guard. DJ Scaife, 6'3", 300-pound guy, made 7 starts in the final 7 games there for the 2018 season at right tackle. He could play guard as well. So they might have some versatile pieces there, but still some questions about some jobs that are open. You got Kaleon Hebert, who who was I know a big target for Florida as well. Cleveland Reed Jr. There's just a couple of names there. Miami, much like Florida this year, questions along the offensive line, but I think it's more about a question: can they identify their starting fives and maybe gel together quickly early in the season to try and get that big early season week 0 win?
Yeah, when you don't have a good unit and you lose some guys, it remains to be seen whether, well, that might be a good thing. They lose the two players that had the most game starts for them. You mentioned Donaldson. He's thought of well enough to be on all the Outland and Remington Watch Awards lists to start the season. Yeah, they want versatile guys. Manny Diaz has spoken to that they want guys that, and that offensive line is different than any other group on the field. You may have 5 guys and be able to say, these are the best 5 guys from a talent standpoint and from the standpoint of being able to execute on the field. But unfortunately, those 3 guys can only play guard. So we've got an issue. So you want versatility up front where you can mix and match. And they've been hindered in that regard the last few years. And they want that to be a better, component there that they can utilize so that they can get the best players on the field. They had a 2-star actually in, Zion Nelson, who showed himself out in spring camp, and he became the rage as much of as an offensive lineman can be, as providing some hope. And I guess he really showed out in the spring, and they've got hope that he can break into the lineup as well.
Let's move to the other side of the ball for the Gators' first opponent of the season. The defensive line and the defensive front. We just mentioned the offensive line for Miami, with the defensive line or the offensive line for Florida. Going to have some questions too, some inexperience that they're bringing, and I know Miami and what they were able to do on the defensive side of the ball, kind of sees an advantage with their defensive line and their linebackers, their front 7. They lose defensive tackle Jared Willis, who Gator fans are very familiar with, the transfer from Florida, who played at Miami there. He ranked 2nd in the ACC with 18 tackles for a loss. Joe Jackson ranked 3rd in the conference with 9 sacks. So Willis and Jackson are gone. But really going to kind of depend on Garvin to kind of pick up that slack there. 17 tackles for a loss, 5.5 sacks in 2018. So some great stats there, at that position for him. Scott Patchen, 5th-year senior. He's healthy. We mentioned going back to the coach's thoughts of Virginia Tech transfer Javon Hill. He brings some leadership there. Miami has some good pieces to work around here up front on the defensive line.
Yeah, so one of those stats that I talked about off the top in regards to showing the discrepancy between offensive and defensive production, this team had a havoc rate of 24% last year, meaning 24% of the plays that the other team ran, they were throwing people back for sacks, tackles for loss, passes defense, pass breakups, interceptions. Highest rate in the country. They were very disruptive. Willis, Jackson gone, as you mentioned, and the stats backed up my evaluation of Willis in particular last year. Is every time I watch Miami play, which was typically, 8 or 9 times during the season, that guy was just a disruptor. He was a monster. So they're not going to be as disruptive. I can't imagine that these guys that are going to fill in, like a Scott Patchen, they're really banking on him to come through, are going to be quite as effective as what they had along the defensive front last year. But I expect the front 4 to be still really formidable. Best in division. Trevon Hill, you mentioned him. He only played 3 games last year. Check out his numbers. He was in the backfield constantly. He had 4.5 tackles for loss in 3 games to start the season. So they really want him to step up and show what he can do, because a lot's expected of him. And like I say, with Jackson and Willis gone, those guys were as good a pair as any in the country last year. And that's going to be difficult to replace. But I think they're going to have a good defensive front. I think they're going to take a step back.
Probably you move back a little bit in the defensive formation, and probably one of, if not one of the high, well thought of linebacker cores in the nation there. Shaq Quarterman, all ACC in 2018 with 39 starts, 249 tackles, 12 sacks, 31 tackles for loss here. Michael Peetney, all ACC honorable mention. 2 years running with 36 starts, 203 tackles, 9.5 sacks, 29.5 tackles for loss. I mean, look, those two guys are, the epitome of what Manny Diaz looks for in a defense. But Zach McLeod's a senior as well, who has started 31 games. Romeo Finley, only 4 starts, but 28 tackles, 2 interceptions in 2018. So some stats to his name as well. Miami, they're going to be looking to create. You mentioned havoc a while ago, and that stat. A lot of havoc's going to come from this linebacker core.
Yeah, these guys have played together forever. I don't know how many people are old enough to remember like the Pittsburgh Steelers steel curtain where the linebackers played together for a decade, Jack Ham and Jack Lambert and those guys, or even 25 years ago or so with the New Orleans Saints with Pat Swilling and Sam Mills and Ricky Jackson, where those guys played together. This is about the college equivalent of that. These guys are seniors now. When you look at McLeod, Quarterman, and Pinckney in particular, and they played together and started together as freshmen. They have put 4 years together, and they've been extremely productive. Shaq Quarterman, he's the quarterback. He runs the show. He's in the middle. He's the most productive, the most steady, the smartest, really gets everybody set, and he's the leader emotionally as well. Pinckney's more talented, more of a playmaker, more of a guy that runs around and makes plays. But yeah, Quarterman's a leader. That's linebacking core that should be rated right up there as one of the best in the country.
And let's move defensive back before we wrap up here with Miami, before we move on to FSU here. 3 starters, Mark, drafted off the nation's #1 pass defense. Maybe a lot of people didn't know that, but Miami, the Hurricanes did have the #1 pass defense last year, only giving up 135.6 yards per game there in 2018 last season. So Michael Jackson's gone. Safety Cedric Redwine's gone. Jaquan Johnson's gone. How is Miami going to fill in those 3 guys leaving for the 2019 season?
Great question. The secondary's thin. The secondary's thin. I do think when you look at the stats that you mentioned, it was pretty legit. But when you play Georgia Tech, I think that automatically would raise anybody's defensive passing stats about 10 spots. But Trajan Bandy's one of the best corners in the country, so he locks down one side. They get a very intriguing jolt of talent from USC and transfer Bubba Bolden. He was a 5-star. We haven't seen him play. He was suspended for 2018. He comes in from USC. Again, we'll see if that's a real thing, or is that just fans getting excited about seeing a 5-star on campus? But we know that the pedigree's there, the talent's there, but he hasn't played. But they're going to expect him to step in. You got Benny Blade's son. You got Al Blades. He's at a corner position as well. And yeah, the talent at the starting spots for Miami is in pretty good shape, but they lack depth at running back. They lack depth along the offensive line. They lack depth in the secondary. And so they've got to stay healthy there.
Mark, before we move on from Miami and look at FSU, what is the biggest question Miami looks at when they're going to this first week 0 game with Florida?
Okay, quarterback, offensive line. I don't think there's any question about those 2 positions. And like I say, there's hope at the quarterback position because you got 3 very talented players. Are they going to be ready? Whoever is the choice for game 1, we shall see. Offensive line's more of a commodity that is most likely still going to be a weak link. The quarterback is a wild card. The offensive line, again, they're going to have to do some things in the scheme to cover up for a bad offensive line because I don't expect it to be much better this year.
All right, let's move on to Florida State here. As I said, the Gators' last opponent of the season, and what coaches have to say about them. The staff was quote, the staff was probably too optimistic last year. Willie Taggart got his dream job and all of that, but that roster had serious problems. The offense did not work at all under Walt Bell. That was a really bad fit with the players and with Taggart, and now they're banking on Kendall Browse. The upside is that he usually gets successful quick. Look at Houston and FAU. He can put guys in and adjust on the fly. The system won't look much different than last year, but you have a guy in Kendall who's really going to control all phases. Taggart trusts him. They go way back. They have to get better on the offensive line. They were handed a short roster, but they also didn't look well coached at all. It killed their run game. James Blackman is good enough to start, but you have to think Alex Hornibrook didn't transfer for 1 year not to play. Either one will be an improvement under DeAndre Francois. To put it politely, he didn't look coachable at all at times last year, and they need someone at that position in this season to help them sell their new era. Defensively, they're strong, especially in the back. They're going to be a lot deeper at linebacker, especially. They lose Brian Burns in the pass rush, but they have some scary dudes inside on that line. Mark, of course, big rival for Florida, in-state rival that they play every year. They hire Willie Taggart. They have a disaster of year one. It was supposed to be, the Gulf Coast offense, his offense, and after one season, they have to bring another offense in.
What's really alarming about what Florida State did last year was I have people argue on the Florida State side, the fans that are defending Willie Taggart, that say, okay, Jimbo Fisher went 7-6 the year before and needed a bowl win against a group of 5 team to even get to 7-6. What's the difference? 5-7. No, watch the games. Forget the record. Watch the game. The games were miserable for Florida State last year. They beat Boston College by a point. They beat Wake Forest, a decent Wake Forest team, by 3 touchdowns. They blew a lead and lost to Miami. Those were the 3 best games they played. Every other game was a disaster. Like, they weren't in games. They lost 6 of 7 games by at least 3 touchdowns. Everybody blew them out. The season before, they're only going 7-6. But they don't look like a 7-6 team. Like, they look like a Florida State talented team, not vintage, but they're barely losing to Clemson. They're barely losing to anybody the year before. There is no comparison between what they showed us. And I think the most alarming thing, Dave, was that, and you watch Florida State, of course. They looked like the week 1 team. The week 1 team came out against Virginia Tech, scored 3 points. So what was the thought? Well, it's a big Monday night game. Virginia Tech must be really good this year. No, they're awful. They've got one of the worst defenses in the country in Power 5, and Florida State scored 3 points against them, and it didn't get much better. This team was so bad that they needed Louisville to cough up the ball to beat Louisville. And Louisville won 2 group of 5 games, couldn't win a Power 5, couldn't win an ACC game, and they basically had to have the game handed to them. And as I started to say, in week 12, game 12, they're still not lining up right. They're still committing just stupid penalties. They just look completely unprepared, like they hadn't practiced. It was just alarming how bad they were for having a top 15 roster.
All right, then that starts with the offensive line. And kind of a theme here with Florida, Miami, and FSU. All have offensive line questions. And you go back to a year ago in FSU with 36 sacks given up. That was 109th nationally. 103 tackles for a loss. That was 128th nationally. All that bled over into the Seminoles averaging only 361 yards per game. That was 103rd. 21.9 points per game, 113th in the nation, 5.12 yards per play. It was 110th in the nation. I mean, they got running backs, a talented backfield, just only 91.1 yards a game. It was 127th nationally. So there's a trend there of being, one of the nation's worst offenses. And of course, a lot of people look at the offensive line as contributing to that. Why will it be different under Kendall Riles?
Well, the track record. So I think you mentioned off the top stops at Baylor, FAU, and Houston. What's the component that you see in every stop is that the offense ranked at a certain level before he got there. When he was there, the numbers shot up. When he left, the numbers went right back down. So he's been successful at 3 stops in reinventing the offense and just scheming, finding the matchups, and working his style. Now, his style is very close in terms of up-tempo, spread the field, get it in space to your playmakers. All the principles are pretty much the same as what Willie Taggart did. We'll see after we play 12 games whether he's just his style of coaching and his ability to get through and scheme it up is just that much more effective than Willie Taggart's. But the concepts are pretty much the same. So at least the players have been through this style of offense for one season. I don't know how much they learned because it didn't seem like a whole lot. But yeah, you mentioned the offensive line, and I think it also speaks to, so we can make fun of Florida State, Miami when it comes to the offensive line and not being able to get it right. But I also think it speaks to, if you look across the country, it is the toughest position to recruit, develop, and especially in the SEC. And we've talked about this, man. If you're not really strong along the offensive front, you will get exposed like no other conference in the nation, because there are just freak athletes playing D end and outside linebacker in the spots that are just going to just expose patchwork offensive line, even if you just have one or two weak links along the offensive line. But the Florida State situation, and I've done some videos on this, just kind of comparing the transition that took place in the ACC Coastal when they were the team. And then you could see Clemson coming under Taj Boyd, those teams, Sammy Watkins, they got really good, but Florida State would still slap them down in the big matchup that would decide the ACC every year for those couple of years. And then you saw that shift and you saw the transition and Clemson take over. But if you look at the recruiting rankings, Florida State, up until a couple of years ago, out-recruited Clemson, even when Clemson was taking them over. And then in gaining some insight, some deeper insight with a lot of the people that I talk to, it's because we're both, Dave, I believe I can speak for you, believers in recruiting rankings, because over the long haul, they mean a whole lot. But in Florida State's case, they were very uneven in regards to positions. The offensive line, like if the recruiting rankings would have been spoken to there, and in regards to player development, that's where they didn't get it done. It was a neglected position. They had some things go against them. Even this particular unit, probably the most talented player, Landon Dickerson, is transferred out of the program. So they were counting on him this year. So it's going to be a difficult spot again for Florida State football, where the one pass I will give Willie Taggart is maybe the offensive line was just so bad last year, and has been for a number of years, but it really bottomed out last year to where the offense just didn't get run, a large percentage of the plays. I'm looking at a number here where the advanced metrics speak to how many yards do you gain on each down that's considered to be a successful down. And of course, on 3rd and 4th down, that means you're converting regardless of the distance. And Florida State was 124th in the country in having success rate on each down. They just were behind the sticks the whole season.
Yeah, like I said, it seems to be a common theme with Miami, FSU, and Florida for offensive line, but it's for different reasons this year. FSU and Miami trying to bounce back from disappointing, and Florida's just trying to find pieces from, just filling in a pretty good offensive line from last year. So just kind of inexperience as far as Florida goes, and maybe trying to get to a point that they were at last year. So let's take a look at I found it interesting what that anonymous coach was saying about the quarterback position, because it's just kind of assumed that James Blackman is going to be the guy. But he does bring up a good point. Wisconsin graduate transfer out of Hornbook comes in. He's just not going to want to sit by idly and watch Blackman take the job.
So it's a situation where Blackman, okay, how good is this kid? Well, he got thrown in. We remember the game 2 years ago against Alabama. Game 1, Francois, a lot of hope. They're the 3rd-ranked team in the country. He goes down. Blackman gets thrown in. He is completely unprepared. And actually, I thought he showed a lot of guts, a lot of grit in standing in the entire season, playing the full season, 19 touchdowns, 11 picks that year. Didn't play great, but considering the circumstances, a freshman, the kid was like 170 pounds, soaking wet, getting thrown around by a bad offensive line play, and withstood that. Got a chance to take a breath, step back, didn't play a whole lot, just the 4 games last year. Had one outstanding game against NC State with like over 400 yards and 4 touchdown passes. So now, he could be, who knows how much he's developed based on the experience he's already gained. But after a full spring session, summer individual workouts now here in the fall, I think it's about an 80% certainty that he's going to win the job. Alex Hornibrook's an interesting fit, because I don't think he's a fit for the offense.
Yeah.
But if you can get a guy that's a capable quarterback, knows what he's doing, has shown that he's got some talent, and has played and won big games at a place like Wisconsin, you don't turn him down. Certainly bring him in. We need quarterbacks. They haven't recruited quarterbacks. They've been a little low. That's another place they've neglected in recruiting, and missed out on some guys that they counted on bringing in. So, Hornibrook in that offense, I don't know if that's a good fit based on what he experienced at Wisconsin, but he's capable, and I think Blackman's going to be the guy.
I do think there is potential at running back for Florida State and Cam Akers. ankle injury last year. Of course, the offensive line issues probably played a part there too. It's kind of a two-part question. From afar, are we too hard on Cam Akers and what he was able to do last year? And then also you're getting Kayvon Laborn back, who I know they were excited about last spring, going into to last year, former five-star there, and he ends up getting injured and not playing for FSU much last year. Is this a group that can really be counted on for Florida State? Given the offensive line is not going to take a huge jump. Can they be better? Of course they can be, but knowing what we know, knowing what they have, the performance of last year, they're not going to just miraculously turn around and be one of the probably top 30 offensive lines in the country. So how did Cam Akers and Laborn kind of take that along with them, kind of maybe having to make up the difference for an offensive line?
Well, Dave, when you mentioned this running back group, it's almost not a group. they've got one guy, and they've got another guy that they're hoping can stay healthy because he's such a talent. But this is another area which they have not put the kind of numbers into the roster development. They have 4 running backs on the roster. And this isn't like Alabama, 4 running backs, guys that are going to play in the NFL, 4 running backs, and then like 4 other guys. They've got 4 running backs on the roster. So Cam Akers, I think he was recruited and signed to be the next Dalvin Cook in that offense, in more of a pro-style concept offense. I don't know. I think it's a difficult transition for him, or he's going to have to show us something. Not that he's a poor pass catcher, but I think he's used to being the tailback 7 yards deep that runs that style of offense. And so he's going to have to show us something that he can adjust. Yeah, how much was his fault last year and how much was injury versus how much was just offensive line where he just didn't have a chance. But they really need Kayvon Laborn to bust through and to provide at least support for Cam Akers, because they have basically nothing else.
You talk about nothing else. Can they get more besides Tamori and Terry at wide receiver? I know they like Gavin. I know they like Matthews there. Matthews probably the second best receiver on the roster, and I really Taggart like what he did in the springtime. Terry's a weapon for him, but I think they probably could be a little more consistent behind him in the other spots at wide receiver.
Yeah, sounds like a broken record, but they recruited guys that were highly ranked. Some of them defected, like a George Campbell, moved on to Penn State. He was a high recruit. Tamori and Terry is a game changer, 21 yards per catch last year, a ton of touchdowns for only 35 receptions, I think 8 touchdowns. So he certainly is maybe like their Jeff Thomas. I don't know if he's going to be a go-to 75 catch guy, but he's certainly the game changer on that side of the ball. But the wide receiver core doesn't excite anyone. I don't think that they're overly, it's a talented group to a certain extent, but not an elite group by any stretch. And DJ Matthews is a good player, and we'll see. Again, it's almost a domino effect, and football is the ultimate team sport. If you don't have the line blocking for the quarterback, the wide receiver is the most dependent player on the field. He really can be taken out of a game if he doesn't, the ball obviously doesn't make it his way. They can be taken out of the game. So I think it's a decent unit. I think it's a mid-level ACC unit at wide receiver.
Mark Rogers from Mark Rogers TV, his YouTube channel. You can find him there for a whole multitude and great content of college football, basically covering college football as a whole and really concentrating on Miami FSU for us here today and on his channel every Wednesday as well. Brian Burns leaves on the defensive line, Mark, and then Kendo Robinson there. 2 guys I know they like, and kind of only 2 guys with significant playing experience as well on the defensive line.
Yeah, Marvin Wilson has a ton of productivity on his record, but Brian Burns isn't going to be replaced. And that's something that's not typically said at a program like Florida State, unless the guy is just an all-time great. And Brian Burns isn't quite that, but he was that good, and he's just a difference maker that I don't see anywhere else on the front seven. I don't see those types of players. As you mentioned, Marvin Wilson's a really good player, productive last year, but he plays inside. At the next level, Dontavius Jackson, he's a good player as well. The linebacking core has been very substandard by Florida State standards over the last several seasons, but the coaches think that they're going to be better. People that cover Florida State on a daily basis that are there think that the linebacking core is going to take a step back, meaning a step forward, I should say, and bounce back to becoming the kind of unit that we expect it to be. So the defense, we talk about advanced metrics and talk about the stats that kind of tell the story behind the traditional stats. Florida State was last in the country last year in field position differential. That just speaks to bad punting. That speaks more so to the offense just putting the defense in a bad position. So you're going to give up more points. You're going to give up, bottom line, more points being put in that kind of situation over and over and over again. So the units have to work together, and the defense was just put in a bad spot. They gave up the 5th most touchdowns passing in the nation last year, 30 touchdown passes through the air. So the two corners, Asante Samuels and Stanford Samuel, don't get them confused. One has an S at the end, the other one doesn't. But of course, Asante Samuel's the son of the great NFL corner. I think they're two really good players, but they didn't get the kind of pass rush outside of Burns that they needed consistently. I think they're going to mature. They're coming off freshman and sophomore season, so they were baptism under fire. I think they're better. I think the secondary is the best unit on the field for Florida State. Levante Taylor's a really good player. If I'm not mistaken, you might correct me. This is coming from memory. I think 2 years ago he had 2 picks against Florida, and I think he brought one back for a touchdown. We
try to forget that game, Mark.
Oh, that was a bad one. That's right. 2 years ago. You made up for it this past year. You made up for it. Yeah. Forget that 4-win season. But man, they've got a kid in the secondary. He's kind of their version of, although he's shown on the actual collegiate field that he can play. But Lars Woodby, Jaden Lars Woodby, he was a kid that was highly sought after, almost went to Ohio State, almost went to USC. He goes to Florida State, and he's the next Derwin James type. He could just be a disruptor all over the place, play safety, drop back in coverage, and then the next down, he's an edge rusher. That's what they're looking for him to do. I think the secondary by far is the best unit on the field, both sides of the ball for Florida State.
Yeah, I can agree with that too. It's probably not vintage FSU either, but they still have state of Florida athletes back there, for the most part there. But the area that I think they have to improve, and it was for a defense as the year went on, Mark, just so many big chunks of yardage just given up. Florida, like LaMichael Piron before that game wasn't necessarily known as a home run threat at the running back position, but the first touchdown Florida scores is the 50-yard run by LaMichael Piron, where a linebacker is out of position, a safety doesn't come up and make the tackle, and he's off to the races there. Terrible angles, just like just out of position, and maybe going back to the whole kind of message here, just not very coached well last year. I think their first probably aspect that they need to fix on defense is just really cutting out those big chunk yardage plays.
Absolutely. I also think that their schedule's a little bit lighter this year. They got hit with a pretty brutal schedule. They had you guys, so a much better Florida team than they had the year before. They had Notre Dame on the schedule outside the conference. So a little bit lighter of a run for them. But the opener's important for everyone. For them, considering what they went through last year against Boise State, a team that even though it should be a really good game, they're expected to win. That's going to be a more important game for them than the week 1 games are for other teams, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. Because with the questions surrounding the staff there in Tallahassee, you get off to the wrong foot there, and it's just the fan base is just gonna get louder, and the nation going to get louder as well for what Willie Taggart's doing there in Tallahassee. That's Mark Rogers from Mark Rogers TV, joining me here on Gators Breakdown, breaking down Miami and FSU, the bookend of Florida schedule there. Mark, one more time, where can everybody find you for all the great college football content you provide?
Just go to Mark Rogers TV right here on YouTube, Mark Rogers TV. We also have the audio versions on Google Play, Podbean, iTunes, Stitcher, and the rest. But the main version's there on YouTube at Mark Rogers TV.
All right. I'm the host of Gators Breakdown, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Guys and girls out there, thanks for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.